The auctioneer dropped the gavel at $75, and the laugh that came from the back of the barn was the kind of laugh a man practices in a mirror. It was loud, and it was pleased with itself, and it rolled over the folding chairs and the concrete floor and the little group of farmers holding numbered paddles like it owned the room. The auctioneer did not look up. The auctioneer had heard that laugh before, from that same man, at every estate sale in 3 counties, and he had learned to keep his eyes on his book. The object on the table was a music box, or what was left of one. It was walnut, or had been walnut once, before 40 years of attic heat and cellar damp had drawn the grain up in long gray welts. The lid was warped. One of the brass hinges had torn free of the wood and hung by a single screw, and the other was so oxidized it looked like a bit of green coral. There was a keyhole on the front, small and square, of a pattern that had not been common since before the First War, and there was no key. Someone had tried to pry the box open at some point in its long life, and had left a pale crescent scar along the front lip where a screwdriver had slipped. The tin flowers, inlaid across the top, were black with tarnish. It did not rattle when you shook it, it did not tick, it did not do anything a music box was supposed to do. It sat there like a small, dead animal, and the auctioneer had described it in the honest way of country auctioneers, as a curio of no known. It was the 14th of April, 1979, at the Halloran Farm auction outside of Ridgeway, in the corner of Pennsylvania, where the coal country begins to soften into dairyland. The Halloran family had farmed that ground for 4 generations, and old man Halloran had died in February, and his children had come from 3 different states to sell what he had owned and go back to their own lives. They had sold the tractors first, and the good tools second, and the household goods last, and the music box had come out near the end from the top shelf of a closet nobody had opened since Truman was in office. The man who bought it was named Elias Bell. He was 68 years old that spring. He was lean, the way old fence posts are lean, and slightly stooped in the shoulders from a lifetime of bending over small work, and his face was the face of a man who had spent 60. He wore a gray work cap that had once been blue, a chambray shirt washed until the collar was almost white, and a canvas jacket with the cuffs frayed to a soft fringe. His hands, when he raised the paddle, were the color of oiled leather, and they were marked all across the knuckles and the pads of the palms with small pale scars, the kind a man gets from decades of files and gravers and springs. Elias Bell was a locksmith and a clock repairman, and in a smaller way a restorer of mechanical music. There were perhaps 4 men in the state who could do what he did, and 2 of them were older than he was. The man who laughed was named Corbin Roush. He was 49, heavy through the chest and heavier through the belt, clean-shaven, ruddy as a ham. He wore a sport coat the color of a green apple over a knit polo, with the name of his car dealership stitched above the pocket, and a gold ring on his little finger that he was fond of turning while he talked. He had driven up to the auction in a white Lincoln with dealer plates and had parked it, quite deliberately, across 2 spaces. He bought and sold estates as a sideline, and he had a good eye for a walnut sideboard or a piece of depression glass, and he had no eye at all for anything that did not have a visible price tag stapled to it. Corbin Roush called out from the back, loud enough that everyone turned, and he said, "Well now, Elias, you have finally found something as broken as your truck." And there was a small answering laugh from the men who did not want to be the ones Corbin turned on next. And Elias Bell did not answer. He walked forward to the table, and he laid 3 20s and a 10 and a 5 on the auctioneer's clipboard, and he lifted the walnut box in both hands carefully, the way a man lifts a sleeping child. What Elias Bell had noticed, and what no one else in that barn had noticed, was the weight. A music box of that size, gutted or empty, should have weighed perhaps 4 pounds. This one weighed closer to 9. And when he had walked past the table during the preview hour and had set his fingertip against the side of the case, he had felt, or thought he had felt, the smallest possible resistance as of something inside on a delicate spring, waiting. He had also noticed the keyhole. It was a Radigan lock made in Philadelphia between 1898 and 1911, and Radigan had made only one kind of lock, and it was not the kind you put on a music box. Elias Bell had been an apprentice once, a long time ago, to an old German named Grishaber, who kept a shop on Water Street in Pittsburgh, and who was dead now these 30 years. And Grishaber had told him on a winter afternoon, when Elias was 17 and impatient, and had ruined a mainspring by forcing it, that a lock is only a question a dead man has left for a living one, and that if you are in a hurry to answer it. Elias had never forgotten that. He had lived his whole working life inside that sentence. He carried the box out to his truck, which was a 1962 Ford with a bed full of clean straw and a tarp folded in the corner, and he set it in the cab beside him on the passenger seat, and he belted the seat belt across it as if it were a passenger. Corbin Rausch, standing by the Lincoln, watched him do this, and shook his head, and said something to a man beside him, and the man laughed. And Elias Bell did not turn around. He drove home the long way along the river road at a speed that did not jar the box. There is a kind of patience that looks like weakness right up until the moment it doesn't. Elias Bell had lived his whole life on the far side of that sentence, and he did not expect anyone in Ridgeway to understand it, and he was not disappointed. By the following Monday the story had crossed the town. At the counter of the Ridgeway diner, over the bottomless cups of coffee that Wanda poured without asking, the men from the feed mill and the men from the county highway and the 2 retired brothers who owned the hardware store had all heard the same version of it. Old Elias Bell had paid $75 for a busted music box that would not play Corbin. Rausch had told the story himself 3 mornings running, and he had given the box a name. He called it the Silent Songbird. He called it Elias's $90 paperweight, adjusting the price upward each time for effect. He said, in a voice that carried, that Elias had finally found something that talked less than he did. Ben Corliss, who had gone to school with Elias in the year 1922 and had known him longer than anyone else alive, came by the shop on Wednesday evening. Ben leaned in the doorway the way he had leaned in doorways for 50 years, and he watched Elias at the bench, with a jeweler's loop screwed into his eye and the little walnut box open before him on a felt pad. Ben said, "Elias, they are saying downtown you got taken." Elias did not look up. He said, "They are welcome to say it." Ben said, "Is it broken all the way through?" And Elias said, and that was all Ben got from him that evening, and Ben went home and told his wife that Elias had that look he got, the one from when they were boys, and he had figured out the barn cat's trick with the milk dish, and had said nothing until he was ready to show it. The box on the felt pad was not a music box. Elias had known that within 20 minutes of getting it home. It had been made to look like one and made well, but the interior compartment where the cylinder and the comb should have sat was a false floor. Thin walnut over steel, and beneath the steel was a chamber Elias could not yet see into. The Radigan lock on the front was the real lock. The keyhole on the side, the pretty ornamental one with the little brass rosette, was a decoy that led nowhere. Someone had built this box, or had a box built, to hide something inside it, and to hide the fact that it was hiding anything. The someone Elias came to learn over the following week was almost certainly a man named Josiah Halloran, the grandfather of the man whose farm had just been sold. Josiah Halloran had been the president of the Ridgeway Farmers Bank in the years before the crash, and he had been, by all accounts, an honest man in a dishonest season. In the autumn of 1930, the bank had failed, and Josiah Halloran had been blamed for it. It was said in town that he had run off with the depositors' money, some $40,000 in cash and notes, and it was said that he had been caught within the week by a state investigator and had shot himself in a hotel room in Altoona rather than face trial. His family had lost the good house in town and had retreated to the farm, and the name Halloran had carried a whisper for 2 generations. His grandson had lived his whole life quietly and had never once, at the diner or at church, spoken his grandfather's name aloud. Elias remembered Josiah Halloran. He had been 10 years old in 1930, and Josiah Halloran had once given him a peppermint stick at the counter of the bank on a morning his father had gone in to make a deposit. He remembered a tall man with kind eyes and a black suit and a habit of turning his watch chain in his fingers while he listened. He remembered how his own father, after the bank failed and Josiah was dead, had refused to say a bad word about the man and had said only, "That story is not finished yet." Elias worked on the lock every night for 11 nights. He did not force it. He fed thin picks the width of a human hair down into the keyway and felt for the pins one by one. And each night he learned one more thing about the mechanism, and each night he set his tools down before his hands could get tired enough to make a mistake. On the 9th night, his young neighbor Danny, who was 17 and had begun coming by the shop after school to watch, asked him why he did not simply drill it. Elias said, "Because the man who built this did not build it to be drilled." Danny thought about that for a while, and then he nodded, slowly, the way a boy nods when a thing has gone in deeper than he expected, and he did not ask again. On the 12th night, which was a Saturday and just after 11, the last pin in the Radigan lock lifted with a sound so small it was almost not a sound, and the bolt slid back and the front of the walnut box swung open on its ruined hinge, and Elias Bell heard quite clearly a sound like a held breath. He did not look inside right away. He set his picks down on the felt pad, one by one, in the order he used them. He wiped his hands on the shop rag. He took his loupe from his eye and set it in its wooden cup. He sat back in the chair, and he looked at the ceiling of his shop for a full minute, at the tin panels his father had put up in 1938, and he let his heart slow. Grishaber, dead 30 years, would have approved. Then he leaned forward and he looked into the box. Inside the chamber, wrapped in oiled paper the color of weak tea, were 3 things. There was a leather-bound ledger, small enough to fit in a coat pocket, with the words Ridgeway Farmers Bank stamped in gold on the front, and, below that, the initials J.H. There was a canvas sack, closed at the neck with a lead seal, heavy in a way that Elias recognized instantly. the way any old man who has once lifted a coin bag recognizes the weight. And there was a letter, folded in thirds, sealed with a dab of red wax, and written across the front in a strong, careful hand were the words, "To whoever opens this box, please read before you decide." Elias Bell read the letter first. He sat at his bench with his reading glasses low on his nose, and the shop clock behind him ticked past midnight, and somewhere at the edge of hearing, or perhaps only in his head, he thought for a moment that he heard the faintest thread of a melody, as if the box having been silent for 49 years. The letter was dated the 3rd of November, 1932. It began, "My name is Josiah Halloran, and by the time you read this, I will most likely be dead, and I am writing so that a truth may outlive me." It went on, in the plain sentences of a man who had run out of time for ornament, to explain that the Ridgeway Farmers Bank had not been robbed by its president. It had been drained by its vice president, a man named Alvin Roush, who had used the bank's reserves to cover his losses in a Pittsburgh grain speculation, and who had, when the losses came due, altered the ledgers to lay the theft at Josiah's door. Josiah had discovered the alteration too late to save the bank. He had, however, been able to recover a portion of the depositors' funds, some $11,000 in gold coin which Alvin had not yet moved, and he had placed it, together with the true ledger showing the alterations in Alvin's hand. And he had left the box with his son, on the farm, with instructions to keep it safe until the truth could be told. His son, the letter said, was a good boy, but a frightened one, and Josiah did not know if the boy would ever have the courage to open it, and so he was writing to whoever, in some later year, finally did. He asked that the ledger be given to any honest authority who would look at it, and that the gold be returned to the depositors or their descendants, and that his name, if it were not too much trouble, be spoken kindly to his grandchildren. He signed it, "Respectfully yours, Josiah Halloran," and beneath that he had written, "A lock is only a question, and I thank you for answering mine." Elias Bell sat for a long time with the letter in his hand. He was aware, as any honest man in that chair would have been aware, that no one in the world knew what he had just found. The canvas sack on his bench held, in 1979 dollars, something the ledger in the leather cover would ruin, posthumously, a family that had produced, among its later branches, the loudest voice in Ridgeway. He could have burned the letter. He could have kept the coin. He could have set the ledger in his stove and watched Alvin Roush's grandson go on selling Lincolns in peace. And no one, not Ben Corliss, not Danny, not the ghost of Grishaber, would ever have known. He folded the letter along its original creases. He wrapped the ledger back in its oiled paper. He tied the neck of the canvas sack with a length of twine from the drawer, where he kept twine. And in the morning, which was a Sunday, he drove out to the Halloran farm, where the auction signs were still up in the yard, and he knocked on the door of the farmhouse until Josiah Halloran's granddaughter, a tired woman of 50 named Ruth Halloran Petrie, who had come down from Erie for one last weekend of sorting. He did not stay long. He set the box on her kitchen table, and he set the ledger and the sack and the letter beside it, and he told her in perhaps 40 words what he had found and where it had been. He watched her hand go up to her mouth and stay there. He watched her cry without sound, which is the way people cry when the tears are for someone who has been waiting a long time. And when she tried to thank him, and then tried to insist that some portion of the gold was surely his, he shook his head once and he said, "It isn't mine, ma'am, it never was." And he put his cap back on, and he went out to his truck, and he drove home, and he was back at his bench by noon. The rest of it moved quickly, the way these things move once a door has been opened. Ruth Petrie took the ledger to the state's attorney's office in Harrisburg on Tuesday. By the end of the month, a forensic accountant had confirmed, beyond argument, that the handwriting in the altered ledger entries of 1930 matched the hand of Alvin Roush and not the hand of Josiah Halloran. The state, in a small ceremony held in the county courthouse in June, formally cleared Josiah Halloran's name. The gold valued and converted was distributed among the surviving depositors and their heirs, of whom there were fewer than anyone had expected, and a portion was set aside, at Ruth Petrie's request, for the restoration of the old bank building on Front Street, which had stood empty since 1931. Corbin Roush, when the newspapers came out, said very little. He was seen at the diner once or twice in the weeks after, and he did not laugh, and he did not turn his gold ring on his little finger. Within 2 years his dealership had lost its franchise, and within 3 he had sold the Lincoln and the house on the ridge and moved, it was said, to somewhere near Tampa. Nobody in Ridgeway heard from him again, and nobody asked. The walnut music box, cleaned and steadied, and set on new hinges by Elias Bell as a last small favor to a dead man, was placed under glass in the lobby of the restored bank building, which reopened in 1981 as the Ridgeway Historical Society. Beside it, on a small brass plate, were the dates of Josiah Halloran's life and the single sentence, "He kept faith with his depositors." The letter, in a frame, hung on the wall behind it. School children were brought through on Tuesday. Elias Bell went to see it once, in the autumn of 1981, on an evening when the society had closed for the day. He stood on the sidewalk across the street, in his canvas jacket and his gray cap, and he looked through the front window at the little walnut box under its glass, and he stayed there perhaps 2 minutes. He did not go in. He did not need to. He walked back to his truck, and he drove home in the dusk, and the next morning he was at his bench at 7. Working on a mantel clock a woman had brought him from Lock Haven, and he did not speak of the box again for the rest of his life. Danny, the neighbor boy, took over the shop in 1994, after Elias died in his sleep at the age of 83. And Danny is an old man himself now, and he tells the story sometimes on quiet afternoons. So I will leave it with you. If you had been sitting at that bench at midnight on the 12th night, with a letter in your hand and a sack of gold on the felt pad, and no living soul in the world who knew what you had found, would you have folded the letter and driven out to the farmhouse in the morning, or would you have fed it to the stove and kept your peace?